Okay. I suppose, well, my name is Willie Whelan anyway. I'm involved with Waterford County Museum with about 26 years or thereabouts. The reason I suppose I have such an obsessional interest in history is perhaps because of my own family history. We're very much tied to the Abbeyside area in Dungarvan. As far as back as we've been able to do the research, my family is from Abbeyside, pre-1845. It was a cobbler out in Ballycoe. We've lived at the same location in Abbeyside since 1900, and we have our web design offices there today. And in the office where we have our web design offices, that's where my granduncle who served in the war spite died, and my granduncle who served in World War I with the Royal Field Artillery died. And it's right beside the house where my grandfather passed away. So we have a huge connection to the locality. I think when a lot of people walk through Dungarvan, they just walk through shops and houses. For me, I suppose I'm walking through history. I'm walking on the causeway where my granduncle laboured across it when he was drunk coming home from the pub. After World War I, he lost a leg. So he could get over to the pubs of Dungarvan fairly easily, but he couldn't get back so well. So he used to get a spin home on the armoured car by the auxiliaries. And of course he was being dropped to the house where my grandfather was, who was an active member of the IRA and served 8 months after getting court-martialed in the IRA. So that's it. You know, when I walk along by the quay, that's the quay where my granddad fell in. He worked as a docker, and he got crushed up against the boat, and he survived for about a year. So as I said, a lot of people are walking past shops and houses. I'm walking through history.
And I can hear that noise again. What is it?
Just the fan of the light. It was right beside it.
Oh, sorry. Okay. And tell me, what is the thing about Abbeyside and Dungarvan? Because we're not from here, so could you just explain to us?
Well, now, I suppose the first caveat I'll put on this is I'm from Abbeyside, so everything I say after this you need to take with a pinch of salt. I suppose, like any place divided by a river, there's this absolute beautiful competition between the two places. And most of the time, it's done with good grace and humour. Sometimes it gets a little bit too excitable, but I think it's a good thing for the town, and actually it's the type of thing that injects character into both places. I think that if you've got opposition, in a sense, you can sometimes define yourself by the opposition, and I think Dungarvan and Abbeyside do that very well. Traditionally, Abbeyside, of course, was founded around the monastery that was over there, the Augustinian monastery that was set up in the 13th century. And it was always very much the little brother to Dungarvan. And probably, in a sense, there was almost a cultural siege mentality over the years. So up to the 1930s and 40s, Abbeyside would have been a place with maybe 300 or 400 people versus Dungarvan's 5,000 to 5,500 people. So it was a small suburb. Obviously, in recent times, it's grown much bigger, and where there's nearly a parity now. And until 1820, there was no direct way of communicating between Abbeyside and Dungarvan. You had to wade across at low tide, which William Thackeray has written extensively about. He's delighted the ladies hitching up their skirts to get across to Abbeyside. And even the geography of the village has been changed since 1820, because the main road in Abbeyside used to actually go up through Sarsfield Street, which is way off to the right if you're coming from Dungarvan. It's from the Castle Gate over to that projecting piece of land in Abbeyside. That used to be the main road to Waterford. When the causeway was built in the 1820s and the bridge was built, Abbeyside shifted off to one side, and the main road to Waterford is where you see it now, the main street through Abbeyside. And of course all of those, what were then very expensive houses, were built as a result of that. So a lot of those houses that you see dating from the 1840s, 1850s, they were only built because of the causeway. They were kind of derived from it, because access to Abbeyside became much easier.
Okay. And you mentioned about your family had people on both sides of both involved in the IRA and involved in the British Army.
Yeah.
But do you have a relationship with the landlords, the Devonshires? I mean, did that make Dungarvan more nationalistic? Or,
No, actually, in fairness, to a very large extent, the Devonshires don't really come into the picture in terms of Dungarvan being more or less nationalistic. The Devonshires exited as landlords really at quite an early phase. They sold off most of their holdings in Dungarvan in the late 1850s, as far as I know. So at that particular point, they were no longer landlords. The initial impetus for the reconstruction of Dungarvan, which, Grattan Square is part of and the Causeway is the other part of, that all came because the Duke of Devonshire was in competition with Lord Waterford to elect MPs in the area. So as a building project, while the Duke of Devonshire was broadly speaking a pretty good guy, and we can talk more about that in a minute, it wasn't done out of altruism, the renovation of Dungarvan. It was done because you could not vote unless you had a freeholding of a certain value. So by building more well-appointed houses, it meant that the Duke of Devonshire, in effect, was buying votes, because the people in those houses would then vote for the Duke of Devonshire's man. So a certain amount of the construction that happened in the Dungarvan area was driven by the need for electoral advantage. They all wanted, Lord Waterford or the Duke of Devonshire, they wanted their man in Parliament from the Dungarvan area.
But I mean, you were saying that Dungarvan then wasn't particularly nationalistic because of the landlord.
No, I think Dungarvan, the nationalism really was more broad based than that. It wasn't. I'd say it was a cultural movement. I think you have to be kind of careful. The reasons why people joined the British Army were primarily because it was almost a type of social welfare for people like my granduncles. If you were not particularly well educated, it was a means of getting to see the world and getting a wage, because the social welfare system as we know it didn't exist. So if you didn't work, you starved. And if you were a poor person, the army was a great means of obtaining employment. So I wouldn't attach a huge amount of idealism to their joining the British Army and British Navy. It was really more pragmatic.
But there is a famous footage of the person being brought through the square. That's correct,
yeah.
Through the streets of Dungarvan.
And that footage was actually discovered by Eddie Cantwell of the Museum Society, and it's a great lesson into how technology can kind of allow us to discover these nuggets. It was discovered quite recently, about 10 years ago or so, and it was actually misfiled by Pate underneath Dungarvan or Vaughan, I think, and they also had it down as a rocky outcrop. They didn't realise it was McGrath's Castle over on Abbeyside. And Eddie happened to be just wandering through the Pate archive looking at old film clips online. And he said, hang on a minute, that's Grattan Square. And of course then I did research in the newspapers and we discovered the entire story behind the film clip. Essentially what happened was, in the film clip it's presented as a propaganda coup. That the British have put this flag up, but that no one is going to insult our flag. What's not said actually is that it was a two-step process. In the early morning of November the 11th, the British got up from their base in Dungarvan Castle. They woke up and they looked across, and there was a huge tricolour flying off the McGrath's Castle over in Abbeyside. And they were absolutely incensed. In a modern context, it's hard to, I'd say, for us to understand how incensed they were, because most of the guys that would have been serving in the castle would have been functioning and would have lost friends and families on the Western Front. So for them to see this almost an insult on what was then the most holy of days for the British Army and perhaps even the British people at the time was amazingly insulting. So what they did was they basically went up to town, beat the hell out of two local lads that they suspected had been Sinn Féin activists, dragged them over to the castle, told them they were going to shoot them unless they went up and took the flag down. Now the two lads said, no, we're not going to take the flag down. Now again, I suspect that wasn't out of idealism. I think that was out of pragmatism, because if you see photographs of the ruins from the time, it looked like it was liable to collapse at any moment. So no matter how idealistic you were, I suspect going up on that ruins would not have been the wisest thing to do. So in the end, they actually got one of their own soldiers up to actually take down the Republican flag. Now, what happened after that, they went home semi-satisfied, yep, they'd taken down the tricolour. The Plaque News team then arrive on the scene. So how did Plaque News arrive on the scene? Well, we need to remember at the time that the major connection to Britain was through Dunmore East. So if Plaque News were filming anything important in Cork or Kerry or Grattan, they were going to be traversing through Dungarvan to get down there. So that's how they arrived. So when they arrived in Dungarvan, they obviously introduced themselves to the local commanding officer of the British Army, and he told them about the absolute disgrace that had happened that morning, and a propaganda coup kind of was came into being when they were chatting, and they decided to go and film to local. Again, they got two different Republican activists this time. We know their names. One of them was a Keoghan from Abbeyside. I can't remember who the other lad was off the top of my head, and they marched them across the causeway with the flag, and they refused to go up on the castle. They got a British soldier to put it up. So if you notice from the film, they cut away. They don't actually show you the lads climbing up the castle. That's because the Irish guys refused on each occasion to go up to climb it. They got a British soldier to climb it, and they put up the flag. Now, there was a lot of stuff in the newspapers about it at the time. There was the British colonel wrote into the newspapers, and the local town council complained about it, and they said it was appalling that British soldiers came out of the castle, beat people and threatened to shoot them unless they cooperated. And it was a disgrace and reflected very badly in the British Army. The commanding officer wrote back to the newspaper, and I'm paraphrasing now, he said, au contraire, there was no coercion whatsoever was involved. It was out of the sheer embarrassment that what their fellow countrymen had done to the Union Jack, that they volunteered to go and take that flag down, that they were embarrassed on their country's behalf. Now, of course, when the commanding officer wrote those words, he didn't realise we were going to be looking at the film. And you can actually see from the film that the lads have the flag as actually tied to their coats. And quite clearly, I think one of them, I don't know, has his hands tied behind his back or something as well. So you can actually see that they were coerced. Now, they were laughing about it. They kind of knew they weren't being taken away to get shot, I suspect, anyway, judging by their demeanour. But you can see from the film that what the commanding officer is writing into the newspapers about is a complete pack of lies. So I suppose that's the advantage we have in the modern age. So there's quite a lot of documentation about that, and it was quite a serious incident at the time.
Okay, so let's jump up to this project, which is in relation to Grattan Square. And just tell people about it wasn't always Grattan Square, so maybe just tell people about
initially it was Devonshire Square. Well, it was Market Square first of all, and then it became Devonshire Square. And of course, in the 1870s and 1880s, what happened was an awful lot of town commissioners, which Dungarvan was, I suppose, governed by at the time, they discovered a nationalist streak within themselves, with the rise of the Parnell's party. And to some extent all the Redmondites and everything as well after that. They were all nationalists. So there was a big move to rename an awful lot of streets that would have heretofore have had royalist or English connections. So, we had Lord George's Street and stuff like that in Dungarvan. All those names then were changed, and they were changed over about 2 decades. And one of the names that was changed was Devonshire Square became Grattan Square. And the connection of Grattan to Dungarvan, we think, is minimal enough. It was probably that he was, at that stage, still a star in the nationalist firmament, that he would have been one of the major constitutional nationalists of the early 19th century. So he was regarded as a good and appropriate person to have his name appended to the square. But very little in the way of a Dungarvan connection. And
then this project that you initiated and came up with, can you just tell us about that?
Sure. As I suppose, as heritage people or history people, we're often asked along to an awful lot of council events and planning meetings. And on this occasion, we had a presentation given to us by the architect about reconstructing Grattan Square. And we wouldn't concern ourselves with things like parking or, what direction the traffic flows in the square. We kind of confine ourselves to heritage. But I had an observation at the meeting to the architect that I thought that the plans were very, very nice, but it could be Dusseldorf as well as Dungarvan. because really there's almost a one best way in construction. These days there's a way of doing things. So what happens is you end up having a homogenization of a lot of our streets and cityscapes. The same stuff gets done over and over again because it works. And I spotted that with the plans for Dungarvan. There was nothing very Dungarvan about them, even though they were very nice. So he kind of retorted to me, he put the ball back into my court very quickly, and he kind of said, well, what would you have us do? So I replied, I suggested that either perhaps you could have a statue or a series of plaques around the square set into the footpaths. Now, I was thinking on my feet, I didn't have much more planned than that. But we are very fortunate here in that we have a very good historian in Willie Whelan who spent a lifetime studying Dungarvan. And in a sense, my job in the museum I've spent a lifetime dumbing down his history for public consumption. So I'm reasonably aware of what Willie's created. We have a really good academic background. So when someone puts stuff up to me, I can normally kind of present them with a historical proposal back quite quickly because the research is already done. We're not starting from scratch. So if you ask me for a top 30 or top 40 of Dungarvan history, I can do that quite quickly on the back of research that Willie has done. So the architect wasn't particularly keen on my statue idea. I felt a statue to the fish shouters, who are the fish sellers, would be very appropriate because women are underrepresented in history for a whole pile of different reasons. And also it would tie in neatly with the food festival that we had, and it would tie in neatly with a statue that we have over in the shopping centre plaza relating to Glombia, to farming. So I felt that the fish would reflect the maritime aspect of it, and they weren't really keen on that because they felt it was going to break the line of the square. They didn't want a focal point other than, and look, that's their prerogative. But they were very taken by the plaque idea, and it started off as a very loose idea. We didn't know what size of the plaque, so we generated about 22 or 23 things initially. But I didn't know how technically they were going to reproduce the plaques. I didn't know what scale they were. And I come from a design background. We do websites and stuff for a living. So I'm aware that kind of that impacts on design, what you'd actually reproduce, the scale of it, the methodology will all, so if you've got a very small plaque, you might want something like a desktop icon. We were at cross purposes for a couple of months, and suddenly I was told we were getting something that was 1 metre wide and 2 feet high, which was much bigger than I thought. And it was also going to be sandblasted. So at that stage we had to revisit. We kind of knew what we wanted to commemorate, but the actual illustrations we were going to use, they had to be junked. I thought we were going to do them on computers, that they were going to be very kind of like Windows icons type things. And it became apparent that they would look completely inappropriate at a large scale. So we then had a challenge, and we got really, really lucky at this point. We had a very, very nice project, and it became a brilliant project. We happened across an artist called Edmund Power, and Rachel, brilliantly for an artist, from a historian's point of view, she kind of does what she's told, and she also is very talented. As historians, we normally don't want too much interpretation to go on. If we tell you there's no fraught on the ale in 1640, we really don't want fraught on the ale. It needs to be as it. But Rachel did that brilliantly, but also she was very, very strong technically as an artist, as a draftswoman. And she did a fantastic job. And I think really she made a good project, a great project. And her dad was involved as well. He's a calligrapher. So he did some of the fonts. So that was the project. And we liaised, we sent the artwork then to the architect. And he did, to his absolute credit, he did a really great job of sourcing someone who could work to the standard we needed to work to.
But isn't a lot of the drawings based on very old?
There's a mix. About 2/3 of the drawings are major events, people and elements of Dungarvan's history. About 1/3 of the drawings are based on work by a gentleman called Samson Toogood Roach. Now, Samson Toogood Roach is, he's kind of like the Westlife of portrait painters from the early 19th century. This guy is a big hitter. He was a bit of a pop star. So if you see miniature lockets on the Antiques Roadshow, there's quite a chance that Samson Toogood Roach is the guy who did the work. That's what he made his money at. He's an interesting character in that he was...
Lockets for ladies.
Yeah, lockets for ladies, yeah. You know these little and small little paintings you see on the inside of watches or lockets and stuff. That's what this guy was specialised in, and he made his money at it. He's an interesting character because he was, in the language of the time, he was deaf and dumb. And he was also from Grange. He was local. He was out by Ardmore. He was walking through Dungarvan on the way to Waterford, and he's a series of these drawings. He's a lot of them of Waterford City as well. And he drew the inhabitants in situ. He sketched them as he went. So we basically have the people of Dungarvan from 1828 as they're going about their business in the square. So we had an opportunity to have the ghosts of Dungarvan past walk the square again. And why I really liked the idea of doing it with Toogood Roach's drawings was, A, he was local himself, so I think his work needs to be commemorated and celebrated. He's quite important on a national level. And B, they're the actual Dungarvan people. I think 9 out of the 10 drawings are Dungarvan. We used one Waterford one of the carriage because we didn't have a carriage for Dungarvan. And I suppose, there's a huge gap in Irish history. Even if you're a local historian, we're very dependent on the records that are left to us. And the records that are left to us generally tend to be from middle class people and wealthy people, even photographs and drawings. And they don't tend to reflect the history of Ireland. They tend to reflect the history of this narrow segment of the population. And of course, at the time, the middle class would have been a much narrower segment than we have today, which is now it's probably a third of the population. So you this huge tranche, 80-90% of people weren't represented at all in Irish history. And in Toogood Roach's drawings, we have them. We've the people hanging around the square, we've the washerwomen. And the other people that aren't represented in Irish history are women. Now, there's been some correction to the record recently, but oftentimes you can't correct a record because they don't exist in the record. And by using Toogood Roach's drawings, we've got working class people, we've got women, we've got life in the square as it was. So it seemed to be a no-brainer. I didn't think you need to be a genius to pick out his drawings to celebrate the square.
Did I see somewhere where it was Ulster Museum published?
No, Ulster Museum hold a copyright on all of these. They reside in the Ulster Folk Museum. So the originals of them are held by them. So when we reproduce them, we try and make that note down the end that the copyright is held by the Ulster Museum.
Yeah, and then the other ones then that are used are not his local artists.
Well, even the Samson Toogood Roach ones, they had to be interpreted by Rachel because watercolour sketches, you can't sandblast them. You have no colours. So Rachel had to redraw them in a manner that would actually transfer to a slab. So in fairness, she was absolutely brilliant. She didn't reinterpret them or anything, which can be a tendency with an artist to put their own stamp on it. To some extent, we wanted Rachel to suborn her art to the project, and she did a brilliant job of that, really.
And did the shopkeepers in the square, did they get consulted on what they were?
They did very near the end of the project. Because I think as we were doing it, there wasn't much point in consulting them. So what we did was I drew up an initial list of about 24, 25 things that I felt, based on Willie Whelan's research, that were the most important things that I wanted to commemorate. So for instance, I would present, we want to commemorate Professor Walton and his Nobel Prize. We want to commemorate the railway. We want to commemorate Abbeyside, the role of the church in our history. So I went along then to 6 local historians that work within the museum, because I think it's important that it wouldn't be just my word, these are important. We wanted to kind of peer review. So I said to the guys, this is what I think. What do you think I've underplayed or overplayed? And they pretty much agreed with me. There was 1 or 2 extra things they added in, mainly relating to maritime history. And fine, so away we went from there. So we had decided what we wanted to commemorate. Then we had to decide on the imagery that was going to represent them. So then we proceeded along, and we had a situation where, let's say Professor Walton, we didn't want to have a series of heads of famous men. It's this famously kind of famous white dead people, I think is the phrase you'll hear used by historians. So for Walton, we decided to use the lithium atom because that was the actual atom that he split. And it kind of appealed to my sense of humour as well, because I thought there was a proportion of people would think we were commemorating the Big Bang Theory on television. But I suppose we are to a sense, because without Walton there wouldn't have been a Big Bang Theory. So the lithium atom sits outside the Turkish Berbers. So once we had all of these images drawn, I'm used to dealing with traders, and traders rightly are very focused on themselves. You know, you don't stay in business long unless you have a streak of self-interest in you. So we presented these images to them, and we used a random number generator to select the traders in order. And we then went to them and said, right, there was about 5 of them, we had specific locations for them. We wanted the carriage to go over where the old Bianconi stagecoach depot was. That was logical. We wanted to go to Danfrere. We wanted to go to the Wine Buff because that was where Danfrere's shop was. We wanted to go the first bicycle race in Britain and Ireland was held in Dungarvan. We wanted the bicycle to go to the old post office, which is now Willow and Oak, because that's where Edmund Brennan had his shop. The guy Ori Brennan who ran the race. So we wanted that to go. But outside of those 5, we were pretty flexible as to where they were located. And we went along to them, and in order out of the random number generator, we presented these are the images. What ones would you like? Now, obviously, and I'll be blunt about this, we had to avoid things like, for instance, you couldn't put a famine image outside, let's say, a coffee shop or whatever. You know, quite obviously that would be in poor taste and not be appropriate. So we hadn't much problem really. You know, if we had any issue at all, it was 1 or 2 kind of saying, wanting to know how come they didn't get to pick earlier. But because we had 4 or 5 unoccupied premises, even the person who was picking last was picking from about 6 images. Everyone got a choice.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what's the reaction?
The reaction has been very positive from the traders. Now we're at a phase where they're asking us, I need you to give me the history behind the plaque, because people are asking me about it. A lot of the plaques have quite a complicated or multi-layered history, because I didn't want to just do, you know, commemorate something. History is complicated. You can read it in different levels. So, for instance, one plaque we have is Edmund Power, Francis Hearn, and there's a picture of a pike staff. That commemorates the 1798 rebellion. And so superficially, if you have any casual knowledge of Irish history, you'll pick up on the pike and that these guys were probably involved in the 1798 rebellion. But at a deeper level, it also commemorates who history remembers and who it forgets. So Edmund Power has a lovely monument to himself down in Dungarvan Town Park, a Celtic cross that was put up in the centenary of the 1798 rebellion in 1898. Francis Hearn is missing from the record, even though they were joint leaders. And what we think happened was Edmund Power got hung, drawn and quartered, and as he was being hung, drawn and quartered, he basically said, damn you all, I do it all again. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but that was his approach to the trial. Francis Hearn was a seminarian, and his uncle was the bishop. And there is some suspicion what happened is when they were all arrested after the rebellion broke down, the bishop prevailed on Francis to make an apology. Because the penal laws were still extant at the time, they weren't particularly enforced, but there was a serious danger that Catholics would come under pressure as a result of the backlash after the 1798 rebellion. With Donald Trump in America at the moment, you have the Bowling Green massacre, that never took place. Protestant propagandists at the time were creating massacres that hadn't taken place as well after the 1798 rebellion. It was a very fevered kind of environment. And into this environment, we think that the bishop might have prevailed on his nephew, say, listen, you've got to apologise, you've got to take the heat off. They're starting to lie down, they're starting to forget about the penal laws, and now you and your mates are after dragging all of this thing on top of us again. So Hearn went into the dock, and perhaps he took one for the team. He apologised for the 1798 rebellion in the dock. So Hearn got forgotten. He couldn't be commemorated by nationalists, even though he was just as brave. And to be honest with you, at the end of it all, he was just as dead as Edmund Power. But he apologised. So you can take that plaque on 2 or 3 different levels. And there's quite a few of the plaques have that depth in them, so.
And I believe you're doing a piece then for the local papers.
Yeah. What we're trying to do is, a lot of people have asked us, how come we haven't put the explanation on the plaque? Now, again, with my background in design, a lot of these plaques cannot be explained in a word or two words. I mean, some of them can, Henry Grattan, if you know a bit about Irish politics, he was a nationalist politician, and he attempted to keep the Irish Parliament separate from the English Parliament. But most of them, you can't explain them. And with the limits of the technology, with the limits of the size of the plaque, you'd end up half explaining them. And if you're going to do something half well, don't do it at all. So this is perhaps where the art of the project comes in. We wanted a little child to pass beside the woolly mammoth in the square that's on the ground and to turn around to his mother and say, what the hell is the elephant in the ground, mammy? We want to provoke thought, we want to provoke questions. And over a period of time, with newspaper articles, with the shopkeepers being told what the history is outside their door, with the information we're going to give into the tourist office, the answers to these questions will be they'll float around the public domain. Now, they might not always be perfectly accurate, but I think they will provoke conversation, they'll provoke debate. Anytime I'm in the process of photographing some of the plaques in the square now, and every time I'm doing it, people come up and they're asking me, oh, what's that? What's that all about? And what's the sword there? What's that meant to represent? And that's provoking conversation. And I think that's much more valuable than us half explaining it in a poor fashion. So that's what we're trying to do. Start a debate.
What is the story about the mammoth?
The mammoth, oh yeah. First mammoth, see, it's working. First mammoth in Southern Ireland was found in Dungarvan. And there's a particularly nice story about it. Again, Brennan, the father, the chap who did all the cycle races, is a real Renaissance family. He was a photographer, photographers in the family. He was an athlete. First cycle race in Britain and Ireland was organised by a member of the family. And an academic. He saw men parading through Grattan Square with really, really big bones. They were from working out in the quarry. And they were heading towards to get them ground down for bone meal. But they were having a big laugh. They were parading through the square. Look at the big bone we found. Brennan saw them and said, hang on a minute, that's not a cow bone or a horse bone. The men didn't realise that. They just thought this is a big thing. Let's get money for it and get it ground down. And aren't we going to be drink it all? We'll be wealthy for one day. Brennan spotted it and knew it wasn't. It was out of the ordinary. And he rescued it. He paid them for what they would have got for the bone meal and studied it. And he wrote an article on it. And it was identified as a mammoth bone. And elements of the mammoth are still preserved up in the National Museum today. And it was the first mammoth found in Southern Ireland was found in Dungarvan. So yeah, there's a little bit of a human story, a little bit of an accident. Yeah.
And Claire, you were saying earlier on that I think with history, it's all about hundreds of years, not 10 years.
Yeah, Grattan Square is a baby historically.
Yes.
It's
But how long will the plaques, the stones, like they're all what do you call they're flagstones?
Yeah, the flagstones. Yeah.
How long will they last?
I don't know.
If people are walking over.
Yeah, I suspect hundreds. I suspect hundreds. I hope hundreds. They'll be there. They'll certainly be there after me. I think that they will be very nice conversation pieces for a long while to come. And perhaps, maybe they might become a little bit of history in their own right. And when they do start to crack and fade, they may replace them. Because sometimes you can generate your own story over time. We may become history.